Did you enjoy playing scales and arpeggios when you were in your own lessons growing up? Do you think your students enjoy it now? In all seriousness, many of my students now do actually enjoy scales. Let me show you why. So when I start teaching scales to students, they don't even know that we're working on scales. It doesn't look anything like working on scales. We start by exploring keys really more than scales. So I'm a big proponent in improv first with many things, but especially when it comes to scales. So we improvise in all my students' lessons, and in the lead up to teaching them scales, and by lead up I mean even 6 months before we're actually starting proper scales, we are improvising in those keys. So we improvise in C major and we feel what that feels like, and then G major, and we go around the circle of fifths like that. Now, they don't need to remember which one was G major or which sharps are in which key. They're just experiencing what different keys feel like. They're not using scale fingerings, they're just playing with one key, one finger, playing one key at a time, hopping around, using their own made-up fingerings, whatever they like. The point is, they're experiencing what scales can do, what knowledge of scales can do, before they ever meet the word scale. The second part of making scales fun and enjoyable for students is starting at the right time. We don't start scales right at the beginning of lessons. There are 2 reasons for that. Number 1, if we start too early, scales go very slowly. And that tends to leave a bad aftertaste in students' mouths for the rest of their playing journey. I know that sounds extreme, but that's the truth. If scales go slowly in the beginning and they're this super frustrating thing, you just associate them with hard work and annoyance. And that carries through even when you're perfectly capable of playing them. The second reason we don't start scales too soon is because I don't want my students to be practicing bad legato technique. So if my students start scales too early on, before their legato is established and they're able to play smoothly without tension, then we're just reinforcing a bad habit. We're giving them another opportunity to practice playing legato badly. If we really think that through, it doesn't make any sense. We shouldn't try to fix legato within scales because we're just reinforcing it. We should do specific work on how do we physically produce the legato sound. And then when they're able to do that and they're reading some pieces with legato, that's when we introduce scales. So that's the right time for me. Many teachers will ask me, when do you start scales then? Is it 1 year? Is it 1 month? Is it 2 years? It could be any of those because it depends on the student and their technical progression. If they are able to play legato without tension, we're starting scales, pretty much. If they are not able to, we are not starting scales yet. Next, we need to start with the right scales, not C major. I know, I'm challenging a huge status quo here, but this has been going back a while. Even Chopin liked to start with B, I believe. I'm not the first one saying this. C major is not a good place to start. There are so many reasons for this. First of all, technique-wise, it's one of the hardest because our fingers are all different lengths, right? So if we're forcing them all to be on the white keys, that's actually making them all the same length. So we're in a way in the most constricted position we could be with our hand. The main issue for me though is actually the fingering. And that's the reason many people start with C major, because it's all white keys, so it's easy to remember that, and it's a standard fingering that we're going to go on to use for many other scales. But that establishes a bad norm, because if we teach C major first and then we go, around the circle of fifths up to E, and then we do B and F, we're teaching students all these scales have the same fingerings. And then when we get to the ones that don't, they seem so annoying and so difficult. But actually, if we start in a different place, they're not. All the scales are equally fine. So where I like to start is the easiest fingering, which to me is G flat major, or F sharp major if you prefer. I like to speak in all flats when I'm talking about majors. So G flat major, it just makes sense. If I tell my student what keys are in the scale, or have them work it out by ear even, which is what I usually do, and then ask them, okay, we want to play all of that smoothly with just one hand. What fingers would make sense for that? Most of them can figure it out. Most of them, as beginners, they played pieces where you have your 3 middle fingers on the 3 black keys, or your 2 stronger fingers on the 2 black keys. And that's what G flat is. And then we just slip the thumb in for the white keys and hey presto, it makes sense. It doesn't really make sense any other way It's quite hard to play it with the wrong fingering and not realize that you've played it with the wrong fingering. So I start with G flat major, then I do D flat major because that's basically the same concept and it gives us a really nice, gentle introduction to scales. And then we jump over to C major and do a couple of the white keys. And then I do B flat major because I want to get it over with because it takes students the longest to learn. We don't want to start there because it's just too much of a hurdle at first, in my opinion. But we don't want to leave it till last because then we never actually learn to play B flat major very well. So that's the starting order, and then I kind of mix it up from there. The other trick to this is letting your students puzzle. I mentioned it there with G flat major. I asked them, well, what fingering would make sense? And I do that with every scale because when we let students figure it out themselves, they own it. It's not some arbitrary fingering that we handed down because I said so and that's the way you must do it. It's that fingering because that's the fingering that makes the most sense. I mean, the fingerings aren't just there so that someone can test you on them and then say, no, you're wrong. They're there because they make the most logical sense. So if students can, with a little bit of our help and nudging, work out those fingerings by themselves, they own them. They get why they're supposed to be that way. And they're much more likely to practice until they can do them that way every time. Finally, from there, once we've started to work on a few scales and we need to build up to working on more and more scales and more octaves and more permutations, we need to keep it fun for the long term. And that means mixing up the way that we practice it. So check out the link in the description for our free 28 ways to practice scales handout. You can grab that and practice in all sorts of fun and creative ways and keep scales fun for the long term.